The Grumman F-14 Tomcat was built for the US Navy as an air superiority fighter, a fleet defense interceptor, and later in its career it was doing direct attack on ground sites. But it was made most famous in JAG and Top Gun, and in this video I'm going to take you on a detailed tour of it. Replacing the F-4 Phantom II and instead of the cancelled F-111B program, the F-14 flew for the US from the early 1970s until 2006. Its role initially was to defend the carrier fleet. In fact, it was really designed around the new and powerful AWG-9 radar and the AIM-54 Phoenix air-to-air missiles. Let's start at the nose with this prong, which is the pitot tube which determines the airspeed. Behind that is the glass fibre radome with the radar behind it. It could lock onto 6 different targets up to 100 miles away and direct missiles towards them well before the enemy knew what was happening. Although sometimes, if the rules of engagement did require visual confirmation, this bulge down here could include a television lens and infrared sensor, and they would use that to confirm the enemy before firing. Below that is the ALQ-100 antenna for the electronic countermeasure. These systems worked to confuse enemy radars that might have detected their location. This here is the internal 20mm M61 Vulcan Gatling cannon. Its predecessor, the F-4 Phantom II, didn't have one initially but was later added due to popular demand, so they weren't going to leave it out this time. It could fire 100 rounds per second, although since only 600 rounds were loaded, it only had 6 seconds of firing per flight. The bullet casings were kept inside as to avoid them being sucked into the air intakes, and those vents there were all providing cooling to what would be a very warm process. Here's the engine intake, and you'll notice a space between it and the fuselage. This is because the boundary layer of air running along the side of the fuselage is always rough and would impair the engine's efficiency, so it's always redirected elsewhere. This had a top speed of Mach 2.3, so the intake air would have to be slowed down to subsonic speed before entering the jet engines. These ramps here would move down as the speed increased and create shock waves that the incoming air would need to cross and therefore slow down. Here's the main landing gear, which had to be extra tough. Carrier landings were particularly intense, with a high speed of descent, and remember that the deck could be rising and sinking with the waves, so it could potentially be rising up to the plane, which would only increase the closing speed. Moving around, I'll mention the engines and their interesting positioning. Initially, they were Pratt and Witney TF-30 turbofans, and they were considered to be underpowered and prone to stall. This was especially a problem when you consider the following. The engines on the F-14 were spaced quite a distance apart. Compare this with the F-4 Phantom II it replaced, or an F-15, where the engines are almost right next to each other. Because they were so far apart, if one stalled, it would cause quite dramatic drag, and the good engine would cause it to yaw and roll, and the plane itself could go into a flat spin and actually resulted in a few losses. But the advantages of having them so far apart is that the space between them actually creates lift. In fact, up to 60% of its lift can be generated by this depending on the wing sweep, and it probably explains why some of them were able to fly home even after having wings blown off. The other advantage is that it creates space to store more weapons underneath and more fuel internally. Under these rectangles, you'd have the chaff and the flare dispensers. You've got here the tail hooks dropped to ideally catch one of the 14 arrestor wires. As soon as they hit the deck, the crew would go to full military throttle in case they missed the wire and had to take off again. And above that is the fuel dump valve, and next to that is more electronic countermeasure equipment. The engines were eventually replaced with more powerful and efficient GE110 turbofans that were shared with the F-15 and the F-16. These provided the ability to not require the afterburner for carrier takeoffs, which was preferred as to avoid lighting up the night sky and potentially alert the enemy of the carrier group's location. The newer engine with afterburner could also exceed the landing gear's maximum speed as well. You've got the twin tails here providing redundancy if one was damaged, and it also provides extra vertical control surface rather than simply making a much bigger single tail, which wouldn't be ideal in an aircraft designed for tight spaces on an aircraft carrier. At the top were more ECM antennas and navigation lights, and underneath the engine nacelles you've also got these 2 ventral fins, all of which provided extra stability over the F-4, especially if one of the engines failed. Here you've got the large tailplane providing both pitch and roll control. This here was the tail warning antenna, which would detect enemy radar locks and missiles alerting the pilots. You'll notice that it doesn't match up with the swept wing, and this is because making it lower enables the main wings to actually oversweep and reduce the deck space needed. And moving along the wing's leading edge is the slats used to increase lift at low speed. The variable geometry or swing wing design allows for the best of both worlds.
Low-speed lift is best created with a straighter wing design. While this is not ideal for supersonic flights where the swept-back design is best, the F-14 is one of only a small number of jets that has successfully used this design because it ends up being very complex and heavy. You can see a wing pylon here, and unlike the F-111, it was attached to the fixed part of the wing. Therefore, it did not need to rotate itself to keep the weapons facing forwards, thus saving complexity and weight. This was another advantage of storing the missiles between and under the engines as well. Now, I mentioned earlier that there was a considerable amount of lift created by the flat and wide fuselage between the engines, but this was mostly negated when weapons were stored under there, so the aircraft's maneuverability would be reduced with a full bomb load, other than obviously just the extra weight. There was a two-person crew under the bubble canopy that provided great visibility. The pilot in front, and behind it was the radar intercept officer who controlled the radar and missiles, and their role expanded later on to include reconnaissance pods and managing other equipment. Behind this panel was the in-flight refueling probe. It could also carry 4,000 pounds drop fuel tanks in addition to the 16,000 pounds of internal fuel storage. And of course the forward landing gear, which also had to be particularly strong as a catapult was attached to this. It would do 0 to 165 miles an hour in 2 seconds, generating 3 to 4 lateral Gs. The AIM-54 Phoenix was an air-to-air missile designed to take out anti-ship missiles that may target the carrier group. It was hypersonic, so yes, missiles have been hypersonic for decades, so recent media hysteria about the Russian hypersonic missiles is overplayed, as this flew over Mach 5 and had a range of 120 miles. It was never successfully used for the US, although apparently worked well for Iran during their war with Iraq. The F-14 also carried the AIM-9 Sidewinder heat-seeking missiles and the AIM-7 Sparrow medium-range air-to-air missile that you see here. Later on, it also carried TARPs, which stood for Tactical Airborne Reconnaissance Pod System, which included multiple different cameras and sensors giving it a reconnaissance role. Later on, it also had ground attack capability with laser-guided bombs. Check out my channel for many more similar videos. Thanks for watching.